So some of those things that we might think of as being like, this is what you do when you get older, it's something you do. And therefore, it should be amenable to the same environmental impacts as anything else that you do. But sort of our mindset, the way we explain things is it's a part of getting older, right? Like, I'm having trouble remembering this now. It must be because I'm getting older. There's a lot of changes that happen as we get older that impact our access to reinforcers. And that can lead to what we might say are depressive behaviors, as well as changes in control and sort of things that we have access to that can make us, anxious or see anxiety-related behaviors. And so one of the most critical things that anyone working in behavioral gerontology really needs to have as a mindset is that most likely supporting and addressing those behaviors is not part of their clinical competence.
Hey, welcome to Cooperant Learning. We're on episode 18. It's 2026. Happy New Year to everybody. I'm your host, Kyle Steary. With me, as always, is your co-host, Dr. Steven Sparks. Dr. Sparks, how are you doing?
Good. And I just realized that I still, 18 all these years, can never pronounce your last name perfectly. But
it depends on who says it. I hear Sturry and Steary.
Yeah, and it probably both from me. But like when I was having to teach grad classes at Western Michigan, which is relevant here with our guest today, I told everybody they had to get in alphabetical order by their first name anyway, so I didn't have to try to remember names. So I'm just not going to try to remember your name, and we'll be good with that.
Yeah, you're a very personable man, aren't you?
I am a person of the people.
There you go. And we are also ambitiously, as I mentioned pre-recording here, aiming to have episodes weekly. There, I said it, it's out in the world. I can't take it back. So everybody hold me to it. But it has been a really reinforcing experience for myself to be interacting with folks much smarter than me and people coming on and sharing some really, really cool stuff in the world of behavior analysis, a lot of wide-ranging applications of the science, up-and-coming research, historical context. So we're just really excited to bring all this to you in 2026. And speaking of great guests, go ahead.
Yeah. If Kyle fails to give us a good guest, he'll just record me ranting and raving and put it up there for weekly.
Yeah, and that's like a CMOT or CMOR. I mean, you don't want that. Nobody wants that. So, but like I said, speaking of great guests, we're really excited to have with us today an associate professor and chair of the Department of Psychology at Western Michigan University. Some Broncos in the room. He's a former faculty member in the Behavior Analysis and Therapy Program in the Rehabilitation Institute at Southern Illinois University, as well as the coordinator of SIU's Gerontology Certificate Program. Received a certificate in gerontology from the University of Kansas, a master's in applied behavior science from the University of Kansas, and a PhD from Western. He served as both a member and vice president of the board of directors at the BACB and serves on the editorial board for JABA and the analysis of verbal behavior. Associate editor of Behavior Analysis Research and Practice, and he served as a guest reviewer for the American Journal of Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementias and the Gerontologist. Dr. Jon Baker, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I gave you a brief introduction there. Is there anything I missed, or do you want to introduce yourself even further?
No. You hit on everything that was relevant. I think it was wonderful.
Perfect. That's amazing. I don't get everything perfect, so that's good.
Don't let him get a big head. Don't let him get a big head.
Yeah, I'm 1 for 1, so we'll end there. But hey, I'm really excited to have you on today and talk about behavioral gerontology. I was just on the board's website checking out the data on the certificate data and looking at the numbers. I think it's less than 0.01% or 0.1% of us are into this. So might be a good idea to work on maybe like a landing definition of what behavioral gerontology actually is first before we get things started.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of the formal definition of behavioral gerontology that has morphed over the years. And so I'll skip sort of the timeline transition. I'll give you the final one, and then I'll tell you why I like that one as the most recent version. And so it was LeBlanc et al. In 2011 who sort of got us to this point and said behavioral gerontology refers to the application of behavior analysis and therapy to older adults ranging from basic behavioral research to clinical applications to organizational issues in service delivery. So big mouthful, and sort of a big change from what it was in 1986. Bergio and Bergio said it's basically studying how antecedent and consequence events interact with aging. And so that's not wrong. But what I like about LeBlanc's more updated one is that it recognizes the wide span that is behavioral gerontology. So it talks about basic research, it talks about applied research, it talks about clinical applications, it talks about organizational issues, it talks about service delivery. And so, it is behavior analysis within the context of typically older adults. If we want to say aging, the issue there is everybody's aging all the time. But we have sort of an arbitrary definition of older adults that's people who are over the age of 65. And that is a 100% arbitrary number. It's actually based on Social Security age when it was first put in place. But you've got the individuals themselves and the experiences that they're having. You've got the family members who are spending time with them. You've got the settings in which they live, and sort of the whole community around that. One of the things that I don't think is captured as well in that definition that I'd like to remind folks is that current areas of practice that are more heavily represented as opposed to less than the 0.01 autism and developmental disabilities, those folks are going to get older. And so behavioral gerontology becomes just as relevant to those individuals as it does to everybody else.
Gotcha. I think it was, like 90% ASD. If I'm, I don't quote me on that. I think that's what
Right.
it was, but yeah. So historically, and maybe current practice too, how common is a behavioral gerontology approach when it comes to providing therapeutic environments for the aging or 65 or older, or are there other methodologies and approaches that are more dominant right now, and how do they compare and contrast with behavioral gerontology?
Yeah. So I would say in the broader scheme of gerontology, we're probably also a 0.1% or less, right? And so within gerontology is the study of aging and the impact on aging, and so it's a multidisciplinary field as is. But some of the areas that behavior analysis tends to get involved in are around behavioral health, mental health, what we call the behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia and things associated with neurocognitive disorder. And in many of those areas, the predominant model is a medical model. And looking at sort of aging as a biological process, and therefore the changes in behavior that people experience as a part of that biological process. So oftentimes the interventions are rooted in a biological approach. So when it comes to behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia, you're likely going to see medication as one of the most predominant approaches. It's interesting because that's really where, if we trace behavioral gerontology back to its inception, it really started with behavioral psychologists taking a behavioral approach to addressing all sorts of psychological challenges that folks were experiencing. And so when it comes to just mental health services and older adults, to say that there's a predominant model is sort of a misnomer, because there's a lot of stigma associated with seeking supports for mental health with older adults, at least with current older adult generations. And so there really aren't a ton of other areas, and cognitive behavioral therapy has been relatively accepted as probably the most empirically supported approach for mental health related services. And so it's interesting because when you look at the history of the field, like I said, early applications in the 1970s and then into the 1980s, it's psychologists and they're publishing the work. And in fact, I was gonna have it here. I didn't know if we were gonna have video or not, but there's actually an entire handbook of clinical applications of behavior therapy for older adults that was published in like the late 80s, early 90s. So you've got this recognition of the value of behavior therapy with older adults. And it was the really a recognition broader in society around the problems with using psychotropic medications to manage behavior for folks with Alzheimer's disease and other types of neurocognitive disorders in the late 70s and then early 80s that led to a push for non-pharmacological approaches. What can we do that doesn't require medication? There was even some legislation in the 80s that put some mandates in around how nursing homes and aging settings might provide supports. And so that's opened the door to a lot of non-pharmacological approaches. Probably some of the predominant models are going to be occupational therapy, and sensory related supports and interventions. And again, part of that goes back to that notion of the medical model, where the idea is that what we're seeing is a part of that biological change. And so we're supporting that. And what really separates behavioral gerontology is this idea that, that it may not actually all be biological. It's important to note that when we're talking about behavioral gerontology, there are absolutely physiological changes, changes in hearing, changes in vision, changes in senses, stability, excuse me, smell, taste, and memory that are just sort of a normal part of aging, at least as we understand it right now. And then there are some things that are not a normal part of aging that may suggest the presence of a neurological disease like Alzheimer's. And so, behavioral gerontology has to operate within clearly, truly medical issues, but parse out what things are medically related and what things are environmental. And so, there was an article in the 70s by Baltus and Barton that introduced these two terms that at the time were just revolutionary for gerontology and played a major role in that change. And they were behavioral plasticity and dynamic interdependence. And so with behavioral plasticity, what they said was that they posited that most behaviors are learned, including healthy, sick, and aged behaviors, and therefore should be amenable to corrective, preventative, and optimizing modification at all age groups. So some of those things that we might think of as being like, this is what you do when you get older, it's something you do. And therefore, it should be amenable to the same environmental impacts as anything else that you do. But sort of our mindset, our the way we explain things is it's a part of getting older, right? Like, I'm having trouble remembering this now. It must be because I'm getting older. We don't use that explanation when someone who's younger has that issue. And so we'll look for an environmental cause. And so we had just this predominant approach of everything is inevitable and part of aging. And then that other term, that dynamic interdependence, is that behavioral events can only be described and explained in conjunction with the environmental conditions. So when somebody says, hey, what do I do about this? What do I do about that? I get asked, my loved one is wandering out of the house now with neurocognitive disorder. What do I do? I say, I don't know. I need to know about the environment. I need to know about the context, because there's this interdependence here of the behavior and the environment. So, that when it comes to, wow, I went way around your question of like, what are the other things?
No, it's great. Yeah, it's great.
that sort of medical model is the predominant one. And then some sensory related interventions are probably some of the most common things you'd see across the spectrum of aging related areas of need.
Yeah, I'll say with the clients that we've had who have, it's not necessarily about age as much as, the reports or diagnoses of dementia, whether it's early onset or older, sometimes commingled with some schizophrenia, that sort of thing. And we go in and there's like, what are you going to do with this person? You can't teach them something new. You can't work on these things. And as we're going through it, sure, maybe the functions that were there in place, maybe the SDs aren't the same or the MOs aren't the same, but oftentimes we can find that there's a very much attention component, because they're in a home sitting there, and the only time anybody interacts with them is when they're clogging the toilet or breaking something, or poking somebody. And it's not just because of confusion. It's functioning under the same behavioral functions that we see from anybody, but because of that age, we're just putting them into this bubble, kind of, is what it seems like.
Yeah. When I first got into behavioral gerontology, my very first practicum that I did, I was an undergrad, and it was a practicum doing behavioral gerontology, and I was like, that sounds cool. I wasn't sure that was a direction I wanted to go at that time, but I was really skeptical because my explanation, my thought process around operant conditioning was, well, you have to remember that someone reinforced your behavior, right? Like, how do you change what you're doing unless you can remember it? And part of that requires that recognition of, first, when we talk about remembering, what are we talking about? Typically verbal behavior. And we can have verbal behavior that's impacted in ways, and we can have nonverbal behavior that's impacted in ways. And so, like you said, Steve, it could be that, that person won't be able to say something in response to something they historically could, but given certain context, their behavior is still just as predictable and understandable as anybody else's behavior.
Yeah, I don't want to derail Kyle's plans here, but I was going to bring up it probably a decade ago, a little bit more, when you and I think, first talked about this. You were talking about how one function may maintain for a certain skill, but another may be lost. And so it's almost like doing behavioral assessment, or even like looking at the VB map and seeing, okay, you can no longer tact this, but it can still be used intraverbally or potentially as a man and that sort of thing. That kind of blew me away. I hadn't thought of it, but it's done me a lot of good going forward, and seeing it's not that maybe the person that we are working with has lost all functionality. It's just, this one function is not working, and so we need to find a workaround on how to use that.
Yeah. I was gonna say, Kyle, can I engage?
Yeah,
go
ahead.
Please go for it. Yeah, I want that was your opportunity to school us on this stuff.
So, an interesting anecdote that kind of ties into that. Murray Sidman, who did all this work on stimulus equivalence, really sort of cut his teeth doing work in psychiatric hospitals. And while he was there, he sort of came across and described, deficits in aphasia, language-related deficits that individuals were experiencing, where it's not that the vocal musculature doesn't work. It's that for some reason they're not able to communicate in a way that they once had. And he ended up doing some really cool research where he basically created a parallel or translational research type idea, working with chimpanzees. What he was interested in there was stimulus control. So that was the way that he talked about it. But he was talking about this notion where when we can't establish stimulus control, and that it sort of puts the blame on the individual for not getting it, for not understanding it. And what he then started to dive into was like, that doesn't make sense from a behavioral perspective. How could we have a situation where someone just doesn't respond to the same laws and concepts and principles that we've said are universal? And so he was able to do this series of studies, and it's I'm not going to do it justice, but basically there was like this touchpad with a 3x3 grid. So there were like 9 different options. And they were attempting to reinforce some very specific ones. And then they were looking at sort of establishing a generalization gradient based on that reinforcement. And they would, as was done at times in research, sort of creating the sort of a lab created brain injury to work with the chimpanzees, and show that they weren't acquiring the response as they were supposed to. But what they did then was they stopped looking at what they were trying to tell the chimpanzees to do and started looking at what they actually were doing. and found that their responses were orderly and were lawful, and that they seemed to be responding to different aspects of stimuli than what the researchers were trying to teach. And said, it's not that there isn't stimulus control, it's just not the stimuli that you planned, that we planned. And then showed the same thing in aphasia. And so, Steve, kind of what you're talking about is when we've talked about language, and that was an area that I was really interested in and continue to be, is around aphasia and language deficits, and where I may not be able to say Sparks when I see Steve, but I may be able to say it in the presence of a car. I may be able to say, so maybe we've got some sort of this. I should never do these things on the fly. Some sort of sentence where, like Sparks would make very much sense in that sentence, and I can rattle that one off, right? Like an intraverbal. But when it comes to a tact, or maybe a specific say tact, we do see those deficits, and that sort of thing applies to all the different changes that we see with older adults. And my area of research tends to be around folks with neurocognitive disorder. And, one way that we might conceptualize neurocognitive disorder from a behavior analytic perspective is that as you experience this progressive neurodegenerative disease, part of what it does is it causes atrophy of the brain. It actually kills neurons and relations. And, I'm not going to attribute the brain as, sort of this hypothetical construct where everything comes in, but, we can't deny that the brain is a part of behavior, right? And that there are synapses that are associated with when learning occurs. And that's the way that electricity travels when trying to respond. And so when you damage that, it doesn't go, it doesn't respond. And so learning then, well, what things are still working, what forms of stimulus control are still working, and can we transfer that stimulus control? So one of the most common approaches we do is basically transfer of stimulus control, which any behavior analyst who's done any work across any population has probably done some sort of transfer of stimulus control, right? And so like something as simple as if I wasn't saying Sparks in the presence of Steve, maybe I could still read the word Sparks. And so if we put that up and then put Steve up, I might say Sparks, and then we could fade out that text and we get that response to happen again. And so like neurocognitive disorder, it doesn't make it so that reinforcement doesn't work. It does. I've demonstrated in a number of different studies that I've done where we've done reinforcer assessments, preference assessments, functional analyses. Reinforcement works, and other people have done it too. I'm not the only person who's done that. But it's hard because what we take for granted is the stimulus aspects of reinforcement, right? Like we tend to think about this 3-term contingency, 4-term contingency. It's got to start with those antecedent components. And only then, in the presence of those, when the behavior happens, reinforcement occurs, it can select that behavior to happen in the future. Well, if you don't have those stimuli really set up, it's really hard to select behavior. And we see where, going back to your example, Steve, when it's during a care task, that can exert really strong stimulus control. It's a consistent stimulus. There's repetition every single day. It's the same stimuli. It's the same people. It's the same situation. Somebody with a neurocognitive disorder can learn what's going on in that situation pretty quickly. Whereas, I tell someone, hey, it's Tuesday, we're going to the doctor. Like, what? I don't know. What day actually is it? We're all coming off of this holiday break, sort of fog, where there was some point where you probably said, what day is it? So like imagine in that context, right?
Every day.
Well, it kind of reminds me of the behavioral gerontology at home article that you sent. They and maybe you can talk more about it. You definitely do it more justice than I can. But they one of the approaches was increasing the saliency of certain stimuli, right? Like they in training or in teaching somebody to independently shower, I believe or some sort of daily living skill. They removed as many stimuli as possible so that only the relevant stimuli were there. Would that align with kind of what you're talking about right now?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the study you're talking about, Zoe Lukac, Emma Williams, and Carola Dillenberger, and it's it's a really cool study. It was published in Behavior Analysis, Research and Practice as a case conference. And so that's an important distinction to make, because behavior analysis, research and practice set aside this category for publishing where it's not as experimentally rigorous. And so it's really valuable when you're breaching into a new area and it's hard to demonstrate experimental control. And in this case, they were working with an older adult couple where, as you said, they were trying to help this woman who had Alzheimer's disease to bathe. And they couldn't go in the room to collect data. It was an invasion of privacy, right? And I think that's one of the really cool things about that, is sort of the recognition of autonomy and assent-based care that fits into that. And also the challenges of collecting data. But absolutely, what they ended up looking at was, it seemed that when she'd go in there, she was distracted. That's how we describe that in everyday language. But that's really just stimulus control. And so what they did was try to remove anything that would evoke a behavior that wasn't supposed to happen in that context at that time. And that's applicable across the board. We just my wife and I just did some rearranging in our bathroom, and she created this nice little basket. She said, "Here's where you can keep all your stuff that you do when you're getting ready for bed." And that was 3 days ago. And last night I said, I can't do this because I'm forgetting everything. I need it sitting where it would normally be. And then I will remember to take my vitamin at this time. And I'll remember to floss and all that. And just that minor change, now I'm getting distracted. And so, that's exactly sort of what we're talking about there.
That's always why I leave everything sitting out around the house, as I know exactly where I've left it sitting. It's going to be gone. It's going to ruin my routine. So when my wife listening to this, shaking her head, it's a real thing.
I was going to say, it's really cool, the behavioral analysis of this, in that you could identify stimulus control and have an approach that would be individualized to the behavior, in that, as opposed to what you talked about, medical model being more of, I don't want to say cookie cutter, because I feel like it might undermine the medical model a little bit, but more of a, like, this is what we do in these situations, versus a very individualized approach.
Right. No, exactly. I talk about the medical model as sort of being this problematic, but it's only because we're using a medical model to explain behavior, right? Medical model is absolutely relevant for explaining medically related components. And so there's a time and a place for that. But yeah, one of the hallmarks of behavioral gerontology is individualized. And I think also it's a hopeful approach. Whereas a lot of what we look at and what we're told when it comes to gerontology is sort of like, it's all inevitable, it's all happening. And it's no, there might be ways that we could change this. And we're not going to get rid of some of this stuff, but maybe we're making it worse. Maybe we're making it happen faster by sort of the way that we approach things. And going back to that example of where I keep things out, I always talk to people about, one of the things that's sort of the symbol that you've become an adult is when people don't have to tell you to do things, right? Like when we're doing early intervention, working with children with autism, we're bumping up stimulus control. We're setting up, we've got color-coded bins, and we've got labels, and we've got all these things, and look at preschool and look at kindergarten. And as you get older, the sign that you're maturing is that we can take that all away, and you somehow still respond in this environment with horribly subtle stimulus control. And then as we get older, we start to have these things that can make it difficult to respond to that subtle level of stimulus control. And there's stigma around reintroducing stimulus control. Like if you went over to your friend's house,
absolutely,
and they had labels on their drawers that, in the kitchen, that said knives or forks, we would make a comment about that, even though you'd probably be like, oh, it's kind of nice. Now I know where to go to get this fork that I need. But it's like that's not what we do. And so there's also that as a stigma and a challenge to providing supports, because it's almost like regressing is what folks look at it as.
Do you all find it as awkward as I do when you go into a strange kitchen and they expect you to make yourself at home and find things on your own? And I'm like, I don't want to go through all your drawers, but I gotta find, it bothers me.
Right. And there you are, like right then you're engaging in contingency shaped behavior. You got to start pulling things and find out what works. And then once you do, you might have to come back to it a couple times, but then your behavior comes under the subtle stimulus control of the location of it in proximity to other things, or like where you were turning or where you were facing. It's wild. Yeah.
That's not where I would keep the plates, but
Exactly.
I have
yeah.
heard that at my houses in the past. I wouldn't put that.
You sent a great chapter by Linda LeBlanc and a few other folks. I forget the names at the moment, but we'll include it in the show notes for sure. That goes over kind of more. You described this as kind of like the good, kind of like behavior gerontology 101. Like this is just going to go over everything, and they describe a lot of other common behaviors that behavioral gerontologists might encounter, like both skill deficits and maybe some excesses. Do you want to go through what some of those are, like what might be common to the behavior gerontologist as opposed to what somebody who's in a different area of ABA might encounter?
Yeah. One of the things that you can't emphasize enough that I think is good that they put in that chapter is around mental health, or some people might now refer to it as behavioral health, and they refer to behavioral health something slightly different in that. But anybody working in an aging context has to be aware of the potential for anxiety and depression, and I know in some behavioral analytics circles those are dirty words, right? Because it's implying that we're referring to a diagnosis and giving it this sort of magical powers. But, I'm looking at it as a description of behaviors and a way to identify when that cluster is present. And then I know what I can do, whether or not that diagnosis is there or not. But there's a lot of changes that happen as we get older that impact our access to reinforcers, and that can lead to what we might say are depressive behaviors, as well as changes in control and sort of things that we have access to that can make us anxious or see anxiety related behaviors. And so one of the most critical things that anyone working in behavioral gerontology really needs to have as a mindset is that most likely supporting and addressing those behaviors is not part of their clinical competence. And if there's licensure in the state, it might not be part of their scope of practice. And so recognizing what those may look like and how to encourage people to seek out supports for that. I mean, there are plenty of behavioral gerontologists who do get specific training in that area. And so, they're able to sort of do both areas. But, that's a critical area that sort of becomes relevant in everything, right? And so like when it comes to neurocognitive disorder, even where it looks like your Alzheimer's disease may be advancing, might not be, might actually just be depression. And if we address the depression, the memory issues will be addressed, or the anxiety issues will be addressed. And so if you don't have that mental health lens as you're starting to do your case conceptualization, you can sort of jump in and think, well, here's one of those times that Jon said we just have to add stimuli, right? But we're not getting this person help for something that could be addressed. So you have that, and certainly within neurocognitive disorder, some of the common behaviors that folks might see: wandering, aggression, what we call disruptive vocalizations, property destruction, changes in sort of inhibition, so sexually inappropriate behaviors, which really to that person are appropriate. It's just in the context that we've established they don't seem to be. When it comes to behavioral health, adherence to treatment. And there again, we can talk about the role that depression could play. So I've got arthritis, and one of the best, I don't, but I'm saying hypothetically, that I've got arthritis, osteoarthritis, and I could be doing physical therapy to address that. Physical therapy is the most empirically supported approach to address osteoarthritis, but it hurts. And so it's this antithetical intervention that I'm hurting, so I have to do an intervention that hurts. And when I do the intervention that hurts, I will hurt less, but I have to get past the hurting to get to the less hurting, right? And so now, because I don't like that, because that hurts, I might not use that physical therapy, which then limits my mobility, which then limits my access to reinforcers that I once had access to, which now we're bringing in that mental health component along with sort of the treatment adherence. And so like that complexity sort of impacts things across all the different areas of application. And, you know, one area that I think is sort of the dream of most behavioral gerontologists is the potential to do actually early intervention as we see general changes in behavior. You know, so you may be experiencing some memory related issues. What could we be doing now? You know, and Skinner's Enjoying Old Age is first, it's a book that most people aren't familiar with. And if you, like me, had some trouble reading Skinner, this book's perfect. Like it's funny because he apologizes at the beginning and says, I didn't write this for the scientists. So this isn't going to come across the same way as my other stuff. I wrote this for the other people. And I'm like, haha, that's me. Now I get it. But it's all the things he was doing as he recognized his own behavior changing and how he rearranged his environment to be able to maximize his potential in those contexts.
So I want to go back to something you mentioned, just because I've been thinking about it since you mentioned it. It's kind of the effect of maybe isolation or not having as much interaction. I've seen a couple family members, close family members, who would have or did receive a diagnosis of dementia. And in both cases, it was associated with less interaction with others. And you said the memory is affected by that. In those cases, is there much research to show that being able to reverse the effects of isolation improves memory after the fact, or is it kind of once it's that damage has occurred, is it gone sort of thing? I'm thinking my great grandmother who lived alone because she didn't want to move closer to family, or my other grandmother when she was bedridden, and we'd go and spend as much time as you can, but you can't just sit in the bed all day with her sort of thing. And in both cases, had we found a way to intervene, would it have seen maybe a reversal, or is it just stop the progression sort of
thing? Well, this is going to be my classic, it depends.
Yeah.
But the it depends is that, so to take a step back, most people have heard of a term called dementia. We now use neurocognitive disorder, but neurocognitive disorder is an umbrella term. It's an umbrella term for a cluster of progressive neurodegenerative diseases. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common type. There's also things like vascular dementia that's brought on by stroke. And so there's a whole other cluster of neurocognitive disorders. And so a lot of times when people get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, what's happened is that they're likely their general practitioner, because we don't tend to have access to a solid neuropsychologist or geropsychologist, which would be wonderful, who could run the appropriate assessment batteries to rule out other things. But generally, it's let's rule out all these other ones where there's something clear, right? So like, you haven't had a heart attack, you don't have blood pressure issues, vascular dementia is not a problem. You don't have a brain injury, so we don't have to worry about that version. You don't have substance use disorder, so we can rule out Korsakoff syndrome. And so it's done by ruling a lot of those other things out, and then we land on Alzheimer's disease or sort of mild cognitive impairment as a separate. Those are different things, and sometimes that's where we stop. But what it could be is something called delirium, and delirium still fits under the neurocognitive disorder umbrella, but delirium is temporary. It is not the result of a progressive neurological disease, but it looks like it. And so depression that causes memory issues would be delirium. It's a reversible form of memory impairment. There are a lot of things that can cause delirium. And so it's so critical. The one thing that, I talk to everybody about is as soon as someone has memory impairments, there's a lot to look into. And our general practitioners don't have everything at the ready to be able to rule the things out. But thyroid related issues, hypothalamus related issues, sleep related issues, hydration, proper nutrition can all lead to delirium. And then we start treating it like it's Alzheimer's disease, right? And so there are some medications that really don't have that great evidence, but it's like we got nothing else. And so we're going to put you on those to try and improve memory. And then we all just sort of accept that diagnosis, and there might have been something else. And one of the most sort of vivid experiences I ever had with this was I was meeting with the Alzheimer's Association back when I was at Southern Illinois University, and just meeting with caregivers and family members and talking about a behavioral approach. And this woman talked about her husband and this rapid onset early Alzheimer's disease. And so typically early onset Alzheimer's disease moves quickly. So he started to lose a lot of functioning, and they were just sort of prepared for like, this is what's happening. But in Southern Illinois, there weren't a lot of great medical services. So eventually they went over to St. Louis and got a full assessment battery. And they were driving back, and they hadn't even made it back to Southern Illinois. It's about a 2.5 hour drive. They hadn't made it back. And the doctor called them and said, "Get back here right now. Your husband's about to die." They found out that he had a heart issue, and that heart issue was impacting the amount of blood getting to his brain. And so what everybody thought was an early onset disease was in fact something completely different. Once they addressed that, all memory came back. Wow. So, it's a depends, but it's important to get those medical rule outs. And that's another thing that behavioral gerontologists need to understand. Like, we're oftentimes like, yep, this person has autism. Now we know we've got to go through this whole like assessment. We need to rule out whether or not we actually have neurocognitive disorder before we jump in. And we can't do that, right?
Yeah. I remember taking the neurobehavioral class and learning about, the breakdown of myelinated sheaths, and then some of the, the heart related conditions that can cause it, and then that sort of thing. With that, we've worked some also with traumatic brain injuries. Is it almost the same thing where you can reteach some of those behaviors, or is it a little bit different because it's kind of progressive, whereas we're hoping or hopefully relying on some neuroplasticity with a brain injury to reteach those behaviors and create some new neurological connections? Is it kind of because we're going to see, maybe depending on the cause, some continued breakdown, that we kind of skip over that part and then try to just rearrange the environment to help instead? Or how does that kind of work comparatively?
There isn't great research looking at long-term sustainability of behavioral interventions. It's an area that we really need more research, but it's impacted by the fact that it takes time, right? But a colleague of mine, Meg Heineke, who she and Linda LeBlanc and I wrote a paper in 2012 about like getting into new areas, because Meg's area is acquired brain injury. And so there was a point a couple of years ago where I was talking to her about that verbal behavior assessment that you were talking about, Steve. And so we actually coordinated a study where she was doing that assessment with people with acquired brain injury. I was doing it with folks with neurocognitive disorder. Our plan was to also do it with folks without any sort of known issues. And we saw some similarities and deficits. So there are some things that overlap, and actually acquired brain injury falls under neurocognitive disorder. But exactly what you said, the challenge with most neurocognitive disorders is that they are progressive. Acquired brain injury, for the most part, unless another one happens, the point at which that you're at is fairly stable for a certain amount of time. With neurocognitive disorder, we don't have great, data to tell us how things will progress and when they'll progress. You may hear about stages of Alzheimer's disease. It's sort of a convenient way to describe things, but really, most of the literature has moved past that because the stages aren't all that accurate. But yeah, we do see some similarities, but probably one of the most common tweaks that a behavior analyst has to keep in mind if they start practicing behavioral gerontology is the definition of success. It's less likely that we're going to see a graph with a line that goes up. what we're likely to see is a line that's flat. And for many of us, we're like, it didn't do a thing. Nothing happened. But when you think about there's this continual progressive decline, a flat line means it didn't decline. It means that we actually did something. And, maybe that was just the point at which we could get in. We can't get anything that was lost before that, but maybe we can help sustain you where you're at right now.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned your paper. It's a good segue. If I'm a BCBA listening to this, and I'm thinking, hey, this sounds like something I'd like to get into. You and Linda wrote a great paper about breaking into new arenas of behavior analysis. What kind of discussion would you have, and what kind of tips would you give a BCBA looking to break into something like behavioral gerontology?
Yeah. So, start with looking at what's been done in the area. When you were first being trained to be a behavior analyst, your classes all started with that primary source research. And so you can kind of fall into the habit of, I'm a behavior analyst. I know behavior analysis, but it's important to contact the literature. And there's two sets of literature here, right? Like there's behavior analysis with older adults, but there's also non-behavior analytic research with older adults that becomes important, because as much as we might think that behavior analysts know everything, we don't always. And there's a lot of folks who have done a lot of great research. What's that?
How dare you?
But there's a lot of folks who've done some amazing work. And here's another wild thing, is that within the field of behavioral gerontology, there are a number of researchers who started out publishing in Java and then left because they wanted to get to the masses. And so they started publishing just in gerontology research. So it's important to contact the literature, but you're probably not going to get everything you want if you just go to Java. You actually have to look in some different areas. And so, I love that the BACB provides for behavior analysts, board certified behavior analysts, access to a number of different journals. Those are going to be great starting points, but you're only going to get about half of the literature. So some of those book chapters that we've talked about become really important. But ways that you can access that without having to have a university account are going to be to team up with and get involved with the Behavioral Gerontology Special Interest Group through ABAI. They have a very active social media page. They've got a website. They're holding quarterly different events. If you're a member, you can get access to some of the literature that may or may not be, sort of on the up and up, but they find ways to get you access to that. And so, that's a wonderful resource. For the most part, we talk in the paper about it's important to find out if there's any credential that you need to practice in an area. And I talked earlier about scope of practice, right? When it comes to aging-related services, there don't tend to be any credentials that open the door to billing, but there are credentials that, in essence, teach you the language of the folks you're going to work with. And so it's very easy to come in as a behavior analyst and start spewing contingencies and, motivating operations and everything else. And I love it, but time and place. And it's generally not either of those when you're working in an aging setting. I generally talk about what we do as, behavior is a form of communication, and we've got to find out what this person is trying to communicate, because this disease has led to the point where they can't effectively do it. And folks know exactly what I'm talking about there. But if I had said, well, there's functions of behavior and we can go into the social positive, social negative, I'd have lost everybody. So learning about that and then seeking out supervision. And that's if we want to talk about why aren't there a lot of people, why are we the 0.1 or 0.01%? One of the biggest challenges is the opportunity to get supervised experience. There's just so few of us that we can't supervise a lot of people. And so you've got this sort of chicken or the egg thing. It's I want to create more students who can go out there and can do it, but there aren't a lot of jobs because we haven't sort of saturated the market and made it clear the value that we bring. But to do that, we have to train more people. And there's that ongoing issue. But there are folks who are doing that. There's an organization called Abilities. And I sent you that link, Kyle, to their page, and they offer supervision in some states in the U.S. And then there are some folks who offer memory impairment issue, Enrich, and I think possibly PACT in the UK offer some supervision. And so, there's this temptation to say, well, behavior is behavior. Behavior analysis is behavior analysis. I can apply it. And there was a time where I probably would have believed that too. But over the past nearly 20 years of working with folks and them saying, hey, how do I break into this area? And I start talk about it, and they just kind of go off and do it on their own. They eventually come back and say, yeah, it didn't work the way that you said that it would work. And at first I thought, oh, that's a problem with me and with what I'm doing. And then I realized there's things that I'm doing that I haven't been explaining and that I haven't been identifying, and that were just a part of my awesome clinical training that I didn't realize at the time, that made it so that I could work well in those aging settings. And that's a part of it. And just like thinking from that mental health and aging related changes and all that, when you're out there working in an aging setting, becomes really important.
I think that's across the board too. There are so many things that as we learn our specialties, it becomes contingency controlled. You can't come up with a rule and just explain it to somebody. You have to see it and then show them.
Yeah.
And it makes it so hard because you can only supervise so many people. But we see a lot of people in our area, and I've mentioned it across multiple episodes, where they're just taking a questionnaire and they're writing behavior plans for severe behavior based on a questionnaire, and that's just not doing it. And so
Right.
I always advocate, find someone to help you out to learn these things, please.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, we're nearing our hour. If there's any questions from the audience, now would be your time to get that in. I'll
I
wind up our
one
conversation
more
unless you have a
question.
question. Go, Steve.
Yeah, just you had mentioned at one point about aging being, and again, not behavior analytic, but like a mindset sort of thing. Like as people believe they're getting older, they tend to meet those kind of social accepted behaviors of an older person. Does that mean if I keep acting like a child my whole life, I just won't get old? Is that what you're saying here?
It's possible. They call it self-efficacy, believing in yourself, and it has an impact on how you engage with the world. But yeah, I mean, ageism, we talk about it in most gerontology courses, the way that we just approach age. And, I mean, it would have been very easy for me when I said memory impairment issue, like when I couldn't think of the name, most people would have said senior moment. Right? Like it's embedded in how we talk and the things that we do and the ways that we explain what's happening. And so that is something that takes a long time just to change your own verbal behavior around it. And if you talk about it as an inevitable aspect of aging, you're less likely to try and change it. And then we don't do anything about it. And then it's almost this self-fulfilling prophecy.
As we wind down, last question: is there, as the research continues and we keep asking questions, finding answers, is there any particular questions or future directions or research that you're particularly interested in or excited about in this arena?
Yeah, I think long-term sustainability, that question of like, how long will this intervention work? How long will this approach work? And that's going to be hard to do because a lot of the research happens in university settings and it's student led, right? So like once that student graduates, it's their thesis, it's their dissertation. They're not coming back 6 months later and collecting those data. So that's the sort of thing that folks practicing would be able to inform and give us information about. And so, that's going to be really critical. If you look at especially the literature that I'm involved in with neurocognitive disorder, it's almost always in nursing homes or assisted living facilities. That accounts for about 12% of people over the age of 65. So we've got 88% of folks who are experiencing these changes, of those who experience it. And keep in mind, that's a small percent. It's actually 11% of people over the age of 65 experience a memory impairment. Of those people, a small percentage will end up in a nursing home. But, we have so little research. And that's another reason why I love that case conference paper, is because like that was intervening at somebody's home in the context where like they actually were. And I think that's going to be so critical for our applied work. From the sort of basic realm, I'm still super interested in just sort of stimulus control and understanding how that changes. Going back to what Steve said at the very beginning, like we don't have a way to assess where a person is in their behavior right now if they're an adult or an older adult, like a VB map, right? Like someone who hasn't learned to speak, we can administer a VB map and be like, gotcha, I know exactly where you're at, let's go. We don't have that when somebody's supposed to have a full learning repertoire of speaking, of engaging, and that sort of thing. And so like that initial assessment's really hard to do. And it also makes it hard to replicate research, because when you look at the studies, they'll say, this person had an MMSE of 17, so they had dementia. That's a number. That doesn't tell me anything about this person's skill set and why this intervention might have worked for that person in that situation and not for this person's.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I think those are all areas that I'm just so interested in looking at more.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Oh, go ahead.
So anybody that is working this type of setting that's got that data, let Jon know. Maybe he can use some of it to study some of those things. I've been telling everybody I can think of that might be looking for a dissertation. We've got 5 years, 6 years now worth of pre and post COVID data on how it affects problematic behavior and then behavior in adult foster care settings. Like, we don't have the time to analyze it, but come sign NDA, and then we'll get you analyzing some of this stuff. That'd be great.
It's sitting there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, if there's no questions from the crowd, we can wrap up. This has been a really awesome conversation. I feel like I could talk another couple hours on it with you.
Yeah, it's been great. And it really was conversation. I was expecting it to be very much like the questions. So I really enjoyed this. It was fun.
We try. Yeah, we definitely try.
Yeah, our setup is I don't look at anything ahead of time. I just come in as a wild card and ask questions. So.
Perfect.
It's the reason I'm a little nervous before each show, but it goes all right.
I was gonna say, how's your heart rate going into one of these?
It's gone down. It's gone down.
He may just go in a completely different direction.
Yeah.
Hey, let me send you off real quick. Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Psychology at Western Michigan University, Dr. Jon Baker. Thanks again. We appreciate you having.
Thank you guys so much.